So hello and welcome everybody to the last session on the third day of BigBlueButtonWorld 2022. It's hard to believe that we're already at the end of the third day, but of course, like I said yesterday, time flies when you're having fun. And so we got, I think, a really interesting presentation / workshop that I think is a great closer. And so just to kind of give a brief kind of rundown in terms of what's going to happen. So we're going to actually keep the sessions within this room. So there's no need to go to the next session for 1:30. We'll just keep the workshop portion within this session, so there's no need to leave. And so without any further ado, I'll just give a brief kind of introduction of both of our speakers, and then I'll pass the microphone off to them. So joining us today, we have Annika Hannig and Daniel Molkentin. So Daniel is an operations engineer for Infra.run, where he is one of the engineers responsible for Infra.run's BigBlueButton's cluster. He's also an active upstream BigBlueButton contributor with a long history of about 20 plus years in open source. Annika is a software engineer for Infra.run, where she has drafted and implemented the b3scale multi-tenant load balancer, which is operating at the heart of Infra.run's BigBlueButton cluster. So I just want to say welcome to you both. It's a real pleasure to have you here, and I'm really looking forward to the talk.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. All right.
Okay.
Then
So,
without further ado, I guess we jump right into the middle of things, right? I guess let's figure out first what are we doing and why. So wait.
Okay, so I've got a brief summary for you there. And so what are we actually dealing with? What is the motivation that brought us to create b3scale? And so the main background is you've got usually when you build your cluster, you arrive at the conclusion that, well, usually there isn't only one application that is using your like one green light or whatever. Also, you realize that the users or even the administrators of these green lights or these front ends, as we call them, generalized, so everything that is using b3scale, we call front end. And so those actually could be different customers which don't necessarily trust each other. And so we need different secrets, different URLs to join them. And that is actually one of the things that b3scale does. And obviously it also does the other part, which means it has a cluster or several clusters I will explain in a moment. Or we will explain in a moment, where we've got several nodes joined, nodes being the equivalent term for backends, which is just BigBlueButton installations. And that allows a few neat things, which means you could run different versions, so let friendly users test new versions, and you could discriminate backends through that. And I think, did I miss something? I think you go into the details a bit later. So essentially, we've got front ends, which is everything that usually would use BigBlueButton, and we've got directly, but in this case, it runs through b3scale. And we've got backends that think of b3scale as a front end, and it's all transparent. And with that, I think I give back to Annika for the nitty-gritty details.
Yeah, let's as we now have established what we kind of need or what we have, let's talk about how did we get there. So first of all, let's have a look at some of the challenges. So as we could establish, we need to, for example, dedicate some parts of the cluster for large events. So, and maybe deal with different BigBlueButton versions, or for example, make some friendly user testing where we want to have some users or some front ends in this case running on a fresh on a newer BigBlueButton version, for example. Also, we need to deal with internal stuff like meeting IDs, and they need to be really unique if you if you basically want to keep everything in one cluster. As with the different capabilities and, for example, dedicated resources, some concept of tags comes into play. Also, well, we need to keep track of the total amount of users running on a backend, total amount of meetings running, and yeah, basically calculate this, the load, the current load of a backend from the state. And yeah, also, I mean, administrators are always well interested in high availability, having not only one b3scale instance running, and yeah, hope that it will never crash, which it doesn't. But yeah, it's actually good to have maybe something like a high availability setup. So this entire thing needs to be, well, cluster ready. Also, monitoring is a thing. So Prometheus exports and so on should be provided. So, well, with this, let's have a look at what we are actually dealing with. So we are dealing with incoming HTTP requests, which are either hitting an internal endpoint, like, for example, the b3scale API, or, for example, the Prometheus metric export, or, well, all these requests are BigBlueButton requests. In that case, we need to decode these into a, well, format, into a tuple of, well, front-end, resource, parameters, and body, where resource is actually the endpoint and operation you're doing, like, for example, create room, get meetings, get recordings, and so on. Then, of course, we need to verify the checksum for the original request, checking if the front end we are dealing with, identified by this front end identifier, is actually allowed with these to issue this request. So we basically do what BigBlueButton does. Well, it's basically we implemented the same mechanic and verify the checksum, and then we take this tuple and pass it on to the gateway. What is the gateway? Let's find out. As you see, HTTP requests are coming in and are decoded into BigBlueButton requests, and then these are basically hitting two middleware chains. The gateway is basically consisting of two middleware chains. Middlewares are basically functions taking another handler function, wrapping this handler function, and producing a new handler function, which is then basically dealing with the request. So we can chain them all the way down for basically dealing with the requests and dealing with, in a separate middleware chain, dealing with finding out basically which backend to select and which backend to pass, for example, the request to. So as you can see, this entire concept is very middleware centric. It's basically middlewares all the way down. So I think it makes sense to talk about them a bit more in depth. So middlewares. First of all, let's talk a bit about the routing middlewares. The routing middleware chain is basically there for selecting the correct backend for a meeting, identified, well, by the meeting ID in the parameters. As you remember, in comes this tuple with the resource, the front end, and the request, and so on. So if, for example, there is a middleware basically doing the lookup, is this meeting associated with a specific backend already? Is it known to us? Then, well, this backend is returned. Otherwise, well, we need to select a new backend, which happens through, well, tags in this case. So we can define for each front end a set of required tags and define the same list of provided tags on various backends. And so we can basically say this is the pool of available backend nodes, and well, we can already deal with a lot of the challenges we presented earlier on through this mechanism. Then we kind of only need to sort these backends by load, and the backend with the least load wins. As easy as that. The other middleware chain is the request middleware chain. It is basically always these chain functions taking a request, rewriting, for example, parts of these requests, setting new parameters, overriding parameters. We have, for example, this feature now where we can say, okay, for this front end, when a create meeting request is coming in, we replace, for example, or override certain parameters, like, for example, disabled features or for example, the logo and so on. And we use this, or we provide this feature in two ways, basically by overriding the parameters or setting default parameters in case the front end does not provide them directly. So we're quite flexible on this part. Also things like uploading or setting default presentations and so on is also handled in one middleware. So it's basically the request comes in, goes through various middlewares, and at the end it hits some request handling middleware where actually, well, either a BigBlueButton backend is invoked. So we pass the request then to the routing middleware chain, get the backend, get the selected backend back, or, well, in some cases, we need to create synthetic responses. What are these synthetic responses? So, I mean, with the technique of basically passing as much to the backends as possible is very good for being transparent as possible. However, well, filtering meetings and, for example, the get meetings endpoint or recordings and so on, well, it's very easy on the database level. And so it kind of makes sense to actually not hit any backend for this and just use the state where we basically have to really check that the state is in sync with the backend nodes, but come to this later. We basically take this as the source of truth and create a synthetic BigBlueButton response directly from the scaler, implementing parts of the API, like, for example, the get meeting request, or in case of the recording, pretty much re-implement the entire recordings API. Thing is, this is pretty much how everybody else does it. So nothing really new there, but yeah, we're quite flexible, at least with our approach there. So talking about state, how do we keep state or keep track of the state and make the load calculation and so on? So we do this by basically periodically polling the BigBlueButton backends and retrieving retrieving the states of currently running meetings and and attendees and so on. However, this has latency. Well, polling is always a good idea to ensure consistency, but you have latency and so on. And so for some things where we want to have a more timing critical thing, we kind of, we have a small daemon running on the backend server, actually listening to BigBlueButton internal events like, oh yeah, a user joined, or this meeting was destroyed. And then this node daemon is reporting this back into the shared state of BigBlueButton, where we can use this information to make calculations about, well, utilization or numbers of meetings running, numbers of attendees, and so on. Also, for convenience, we can use this node daemon to really easy set up new nodes in the cluster, because, well, if a new node is joining the cluster, it gets auto-registered at the BigBlueButton we are using this info directly from the Redis event bus, essentially. The webhooks didn't really cut it in this case. So yeah, for convenience, these are basically already, you can register this. Okay, so speaking about polling and background tasks and so on, yeah, this is a thing which, for example, comes into where you have to consider it when doing these, when you do basically deploying b3scale in a cluster setup. To make it scale horizontally, b3scale is the application itself is completely stateless, and all persisted and shared state across instances is stored in a Postgres database. This Postgres database can, of course, be clustered again, but this is basically a different issue. So, however, this comes to when an interesting part now is how to deal with actually background tasks like polling the current state of nodes and so on, and refreshing the node state. To prevent these from happening too often and so on, these tasks are basically distributed across these instances using a command queue in the Postgres database. And so not accidentally multiple instances are hitting the backends like crazy and so on. All right. Thing about administration, as I already said, it's kind of API-centric, API-focused. There is an API, it's a RESTful API for managing backends and front ends and updating, for example, front end and backend settings like required tags, default parameters, and so on. And for administrative purposes, we provide a b3scale CTL, a command line interface client, which is actually just an API client consuming this API. Like you could integrate this into automation tools or into well, front ends for managing it. But well, even our own API, our own controlling client is basically just an API client. So what's left? Monitoring. We kind of want to have actually metrics about what's going on the server, is everything running smoothly and so on. So we are just utilizing a Prometheus exporting the current state of the cluster, where, for example, total numbers of attendees are calculated and so on. And we can export it, like, for example, in users and rooms, or attendees by front end, or BBB users per server. And yeah, I hope this is helpful. And I guess with this in mind, let's talk cloud.
And so apparently I became the cloud guy. I'll do the cloud thing. So what do we mean by that? You skip the slide. I think you're in control right now, or I can just take control. What? Okay. So we've got this nifty tool called b3scale operator for quite a few weeks now. And what this does is essentially assume you run several things or you run all your front ends, what we just named front ends, meaning, for instance, Greenlight or Nextcloud or whatever, you run this in Kubernetes. And you want to be able to access BigBlueButton through b3scale. Then you simply deploy the b3scale operator, which receives an API token to talk to b3scale. And then you can, with a very simple custom resource definition, create a new front end for b3scale and a config map and a secret that provides all the things that you need to provide the information, like the front end secret and URL and whatnot, to your deployment, which is basically something like this. So this would, for instance, set up a BBB front end, which is basically a front end for your BBB cluster, in the b3scale testing namespace, and it's setting a default presentation. So my default presentation PDF would become the default presentation for that tenant. And required task BBB23 media soup means all nodes tagged BBB23 media soup would be the nodes that this particular front end can make use of. Node 25, no BBB23 without media soup, because that's the way we handle our tagging. And yeah. I think that's also just worth mentioning, because that makes things just so much more convenient, because we do host a lot of front ends, and that may be a bit special if you just have one or two front ends. It's easy to do, but if you actually need to maintain multiple ones, then this comes quite handy in a Kubernetes scenario. And finally, I want to lay out our plans. The node D that runs on the individual BigBlueButton nodes currently connects directly to the database and does this provides or uses the same locking mechanism that b3scale node D does. We are actually planning to make this use the very same API that everyone else does. And the big plus would be that b3scale then could automatically run in Kubernetes as well, using Patroni as a database entity. I know there has been Kubernetes BBB for Kubernetes efforts in the past, and I think there's even at least one university using it, but it's not recommended. And at this point, the challenges do not outweigh the benefits, because frankly, the Ansible role just works. And so yeah, but that's the let's say immediate plans, but we're of course open to other things. And with that, thank you, and we'll take your questions. So
I see multiple users are typing.
did you answer the cumulative data question?
I guess it depends if you if you put it into a database where you can make this kind of calculations, right? I mean, have you tried this, Daniel?
No.
Me neither.
The question about temporary recording URLs, that will be something for you, I guess.
Yeah, so recording URLs, what do you mean with temporary? So thing about handling the recording URLs is kind of, I'm still not 100% glad how it's done. So it's pretty much very close to how BigBlueButton itself is doing this. So the security of the recording URL is basically relying on the on not knowing the secret internal meeting ID. And this is the case with basically BigBlueButton itself right now. And right now, I didn't implement any mitigations, which makes this a bit better, maybe.
Temporary.
Oh, so yeah. You mean you have like a shared URL and then you use send file or something? Could be interesting.
And the front end would need to support it, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the front end would need to support this. So right now, the URL you get from the front end is basically calculated calculated up front. However, thing is, making this temporary, I mean, how would you invalidate this, right? There's always this problem of cache invalidation and stuff like this. And I don't know, maybe some, I guess the front end would need some additional feature like, okay, please create a temporary share URL or something. Yeah, however, yes, this is a possibility. I wonder, the thing is, an unexpected behavior like this should be communicated to the user, I guess. Because
actually,
I don't know how many people actually rely on having this link available for a couple of days or something, right?
And about auto-scaling to the backend nodes. So first of all, the get recording thing is something we'll get to in the workshop part. It's actually a very important point. About the auto-scaling, we could. I saw your presentation, although I was already busy getting ready for our talk. But I see no reason why we could make it div compatible. Very.
Right, and we still have about 4 more minutes until the workshop portion of the session is going to begin. So if anybody has any additional questions that they want to ask, you have plenty of time.
Guess we rushed a bit through the technical part.
Well, I mean, if there's no questions, we could also take advantage of kind of the 3 minutes that we have. If people want to go get a glass of water or take a trip to the bathroom, what have you, this would be probably the perfect time.
Yep, I just loaded the new presentation, and if given that we have the time, I would also actually start a small poll.
I also see we got a question here from Dimitri and Fred. So you're running the front ends on Kubernetes as well. And then Fred asked, what language did you write b3scale in? Annika's too fast.
Yeah.
He's already on it.
Yeah, I already answered this in chat.
Awesome.
So it's written in Go, because Go is incredibly nice for basically dealing with incoming HTTP requests and producing HTTP responses. So it's kind of one of the core Go domains. I mean, I considered writing it in Erlang, but well, I didn't. So
let's stick
yeah.
with Go.
I mean, Go is. I mean, with Go, it's at least possible to find some people to maybe contribute a bit and are not completely weirded out by the syntax.
And are we running the front ends on Kubernetes as well? Yes, most front ends we do. We're actually migrating our front ends to Kubernetes at the moment. Just because it's that much easier compared to a bunch of basically equally configured virtual machines. And rolling back is an option, which is also possible with virtual machines, but there is a value in Kubernetes at this point in scale. So the backends we run on virtual machines, and we bring them up with Terraform, and basically provision them with Ansible. Cloning, yeah, we've made bad experiences with cloning, and Ansible actually is pretty fast. The only obstacle, if you wanted to make it even faster, is like if you really wanted to make it faster, you would need to pre-generate the LibreOffice image for the conversion. That's what actually takes like 15 out of 20 minutes. And I can actually, like, if we see our cluster running into limits, then 5 minutes is not an issue. Because we usually keep our cluster over provisioned because it's our own hardware. It's not much of a deal. Yeah, it takes 15 minutes, but if you look at it, it's like most of the time is actually taken by creating a custom container for LibreOffice. And if you manage to pre-tag that and download it from somewhere, then this actually reduces significantly in time. It's not 3 minutes, but it's significantly faster.
Alrighty, so it's 1:31, and so if you guys are ready, I think we are in good standing to transition to the workshop portion of the session. So Annika, Daniel, I will hand it back to you.
Okay, thank you. I'll just briefly open with a small poll. So actually, I would like to start this poll. Who are you? Oh, and a nice typo. Oh, great. Quite a few load balancer developers. Could you share what you are developing? Like in the chat. That would be awesome. With Ahmad, I knew who he is. Not sure about everyone else. Anyway, well, responses are coming in. Welcome to our small workshop. And so we actually want to, so everyone who's here to see a comparison of scalars with in-depth feature comparison, that is not what we're doing. What we're going to do is we're going to look at several scalars, and then we try to see what they have in common and what they don't have in common. And then the plan is to derive some future perspective for scaling of BBB, and maybe we come to a common understanding. And of course, there is a bias. I mean, we are both we've both written a scalar, but I mean, there was a reason for that, and we'll brush on this in the ongoing slides. But I am trying to make this as as focused as possible. I'm not trying to push any given scalar. I'm trying to push ideas, obviously. I mean, otherwise it would be a bit boring. So, and for those who either didn't attend the last session sorry, first of all, so purpose, we want to establish a common vocabulary. Then we will do an overview. It's just not going to be in depth. I'll draw a personal conclusion, and then we should enter a discussion phase, and we can decide if we want to enter recording there or keep it running. So definitions, first of all, a load balancer or a scaler is basically what emulates the BBB API for front end and distributed calls to one or more backends, which begs the question, what is a front end? Front is the same as a tenant, depending on the implementation. Some use both. I think I'm at fault of introducing the term tenancy in b3scale, even though technically it's a front end. So this is any application that uses BigBlueButton through the scaler, for instance, Greenlight, and the backend is the same as a node. It's just a BigBlueButton server that is part of a cluster. So I was trying to compile a list of actively maintained load balancers / scalers, which for the purpose of this talk, I will treat equivalently. There is obviously Scalelite from Lineside. There is b3scale that you hopefully just listened to. There is, and if you didn't, the talk about b3scale by Annika Hannig will be online in a couple of days. There is b3lb, which is actually pretty close to the feature set of b3scale written in Python and Django. And I'm not saying pretty close that it's like less developed or more developed. It's just slightly different feature sets. Then there's BBBWorld, which is not to be confused with b3scale, which is done by the Darmstadt Technical University. Also a product mostly written in Python and Django, and they actually have a focus on recordings and handling the sessions within the scaler and the neat UI. Then on the other side of the scale, there is TinyScale, which I happen to find. And that is just very, very basic and written in TypeScript with the Dino runtime. And Scalelite from a company called Readvise. It's proprietary, and I just found it a few hours prior to this talk, so I can't give an evaluation. It looks fancy, but yeah, I don't know. And obviously, sorry if your scaler is missing, and if it's there, it's obviously not an endorsement, especially not on the side of the BigBlueButton project. It's just really the best I could find. If your product or project is not in here, maybe we need to talk either about my research skills, or we need to make your project more visible. It is quite a list, though. That's true, and that is also something that I want to talk about. But first, there is also software that has dedicated backend handling, even though it's technically not a scaler itself. There is the Zenf called BBB API proxy, which basically retrofits Scalelite with to serve multiple front ends by so basically it issues multiple API secrets, which is how it discriminates different front ends. And so that way Zenfcall was able to fulfill the GDPR requirements of providing like small non-for-profit organizations with their own Greenlight or whatever. So they basically would hand out an API key that everyone else could be using if they are a non-profit. I think that's mostly how Zenfcall operates as a non-for-profit themselves. Then there is Pylos, and I saw at least one Pylos person here. Yeah, Samuel. And what they did, he told me, is interesting. So Pylos essentially is an alternative to Greenlight, and they support multiple backends, and that's mostly for the purpose of discriminating small and large meetings. I hope that sums it up correctly. So you sometimes need to make a good guess on which backend to pick, because can be a huge difference if you have a lecture or if you have like just a small meeting or whatever. And then I found the OpenOLA CMS, which someone hinted me to. And they're a CMS, and they also implement a load balancer. And for the very same reason, they need to know their meeting sizes. So that's a good incentive to implement parts of a scaler or a complete scaler. And so we see that there's two patterns, like the load balancing only one-to-n thing, or the M2N, where there's actually multi-tenancy implemented. And we also see the main purposes. It's separating entities, be it for GDPR reasons, be it to be able to issue the API keys, to make good use of the cluster that may otherwise go unused, and to allow for different meeting types. Yes, and Samuel also raises the point that you may want to choose whether your backend's in the cloud or on-prem. And so basically, as I went through these solutions, I realized certain things, or I observed certain things. There are a lot of scalers and load balancers today, and Fred also noticed how many there are, and they're all excellent in what they are supposed to do. Like, they've all been created for a very domain-specific purpose. And I mean, the pandemic hit, the API was quite well documented, so everyone went to create their own solution that works for them, and it's great. Some solutions work around Scalelite implementations. Others just found it more convenient to also be able to control the scaling aspects as they did other parts. And what's also interesting is that some do a lot more than just scaling, be it controlling the backend nodes, scaling them out, whatever. I can provide the link to the BBB API proxy. The slides actually have links in them, but I can also try to find it for you. Second, I just don't have it handy at the moment. And so the conclusions from that is that BigBlueButton should probably provide native support for meeting type hinting, or other types or other aspects that would make choosing a backend interesting, and that should be a native feature. Thank you, Annika. I will make them available. Scaling or load balancing needs to take into focus things like meeting scheduling. That is, make sure that certain things like the dial-in numbers or certain aspect of the recording are known when a meeting is scheduled. That is important, and that needs help from BigBlueButton itself. Like, there's some scalers that implement some kind of compromise there, and it works better than having nothing. But ideally, this is something. Exactly. So Fred suggests we could define some standard meta parameters for passing meeting types, so all front ends could use this. And this is something that I was looking forward towards doing. And ideally, we should strive for a unified, extensible, API-driven scalar load balancer with a rich ecosystem. So not everyone needs to maintain their own code base, and the principle should be the Unix principle: do one thing but do it well. And if we need extensibility, maybe the b3scale middleware concept is something that could be adopted. And again, I'm not suggesting like use b3scale or drop Scalelite or whatever. It's just, an idea that I want everyone to take and hopefully run with it. So let's see what comes out of this, because otherwise this is basically the part where we could enter the discussion. And it's almost on the spot.
Hi, Daniel. Could you go back to the previous slide?
I can.
Really good talk. And I think you made a comment earlier. So this is Fred, by the way. So you made a comment earlier about when the pandemic hit, all of us ran off and built our own load balancers. And just funny background, Scalelite, which from Blindside Networks, was actually built for a customer, Suzhou Liverpool University in China. We met them at the Moodle in 2019. They were running a pool of BigBlueButton servers. The pandemic hadn't quite hit North America yet. We had this window of a few weeks where they were a customer of ours and they really wanted to run BigBlueButton at scale because they were in the middle of the pandemic. And so we set aside 3 weeks. We challenged ourselves, could we run a load balancer? And we did it. And then the pandemic hit us. And then we just sort of supported the load balancer as best we could. And of course, it started to spread. And we were quite busy doing many things related to BigBlueButton, because that's what Blindside Networks pretty much focuses on a lot. And then, of course, there was more that people wanted to do to scale. So that's how we kind of came to the project where there were many scalers that sort of appeared, because Blindside Networks really couldn't keep up with the demand. And as best as we could, and it was sometimes frustrating for us because we knew we wanted to do more, but it was a trade-off. Do we make BigBlueButton better for everybody, or do we make the scaler better? And one comment I'll make from this is, not everybody can be core BigBlueButton developers, and not everybody can be BigBlueButton administrators. You need both. So when you looked at that slide up there, I looked at that as a healthy ecosystem of people who are doing administrators, and there's certainly, if you've been watching the earlier talks, a healthy ecosystem of people focusing on like the core of BigBlueButton. And so all that leads to, how can we, there's a question of how do we make it easier for the ecosystem to flourish? Because the world's a big place. There is one BigBlueButton, and let me tell you, it's a bit of a project. We have fortunately not seen 5 different forks of BigBlueButton around the world. I know they're out there, but eventually they all come back home at some point. This is just too hard. The load balancer in that is kind of like this nicely defined piece where I think given smart developers like yourself, Annika, and others could sit down for 3 weeks and probably bang out a load balancer. It's not super hard. The hard part is actually doing it at scale. Administration, configuration, recordings, keeping up with the API, and so on and so on. So maybe I think that there's sort of two branches for the discussion. One is, do we look to unify all the load balancers? My gut is maybe they will kind of coalesce naturally as time goes on. But what we can really do is make it easier for anybody who wants to do load balancing to have kind of like a complete list of things that are all predefined set up, so that if they have that 3 weeks or you want to continue working on it, the communities come together and said, look, there may be the meeting example is a great example of one. Sometimes the front end can know that, hey, this meeting is like a really important meeting, and it needs to be put onto its own BigBlueButton server because it's going to be large. Then if there was a standard way of passing that to along as an API call, like a meta parameter, then any load balancer could take that parameter and say, I know that this is a special meeting. And if we sat down and provided, in fact, I'd welcome if you guys want to draft, information that the front end could pass to a load balancer that would enable the load balancer have an easier go of it. Then we could publish that up, circulate it in the community, and we could all use it. Those are my kind of initial thoughts in terms of what the projects in terms of the load balancers could do. I'm trying to think of examples in open source, like FFmpeg split, but then it really didn't. At the end, everybody just gave up, went back to FFmpeg. There are lots of web servers. There's 2 major web servers out there, like Apache and Nginx. Of course, you could argue that there's many others. Both kind of serve different needs, different user case. And I guess what I was saying, like, was there an opportunity where we could have created one particular load balancer for everybody? Yes, but it didn't happen. And I think that's okay, because everybody got to a good place, and sometimes with their own. But Yeah, those are my thoughts so far.
And again, I don't think we need like this convention versus unified implementation. It's two different concepts. That's why I put them out there. One can include the other, but obviously, like having this one single thing is not very, let's say, open sourcey, maybe. On the other hand, it depends a bit on what we consider important. We as companies, and we as a community. Like if we decide that a load balancer is critical enough to consider an essential part of the project, then maybe, as you said, coalescing towards it more or less in a defined manner or undefined manner, I don't know, is a good idea, or may actually just turn out by itself. But if we figure out that it's really just mostly conventions that need to be implemented, then sure, then maybe it's not necessary. What I really found is that what we definitely need is like some sort of exchange about the pain points that the existing developers have. And then maybe base changes in BigBlueButton on that. And then maybe we can just keep the load balancers as they are. Like, for instance, the meeting schedule thing. We had other examples. I forgot. It's too hot. Sorry.
That's okay. Definitely coalesce into what infrastructure or what information coming from the BigBlueButton can help the load balancers. And the various scales of the load balancers just blew us away as well. Like when Baden-Württemberg scaled up, I never thought that was going to be possible. I think one challenge and sort of one thing that leads to different load balancers, and sometimes it's just the language choices. I'd love to rewrite it in Rust, but I don't have the Rust skills to do that. It's kind of fun to see it. So I think the previous b3scale or the previous Terry's was Divim.
PHP.
Yeah, we choose the tools that we know, like the language we know: PHP, Ruby, Python. Right? There was a reason why all the different load balancers are written. That does provide a bit of a barrier to try to coalesce around them, because we all have to sort of pick the implementation and have enough resources to be comfortable with it. Felipe makes a comment in the chat. So speaking on behalf of the BigBlueButton or from the BigBlueButton project perspective, we do want to change the API. The API is 10 years old. We would like to have a more REST API, and I think there is some documentation out there. That's something that all the load balancers we should get together on, and because it would trigger changes in the API. We'll not drop support for the existing API, but if we can make companies, if we can make it easier for people out there to integrate with BigBlueButton because they have like a modern, API that's well documented. There's a couple Postman, or there's a couple ways that people will document APIs now, using one or two of these tools that are like front-end websites for just creating APIs. We would want to do it in a way that makes it super easy for other people, but that triggers a change if we want to support that API in the load balancers. We're not unaware of that. So that's why the API for BigBlueButton hasn't changed recently, or it's only slightly improved or extended, but there's been kind of minimal changes, the most minimal changes we can make. But we also know that there's a newer version that we would want to get to at some point. Daniel, Annika, how much resources do you put into the load balancer? Like, is it a full-time job for you guys?
So initially, yes, it was a full-time job for me for most of 2020, well, half of 2021, I guess, where this project was funded by Prototype Fund. And yeah, right now I'm basically doing some maintenance work and improving the features and implementing this API consuming node daemon right now. And yeah, so no, right now it's not a full-time job, but well, it takes obviously it takes some time to maintain software. I mean, I have also this other open source tool, which is a BGP looking glass, and well, software maintenance takes its time, right? And should never be unconsidered, right?
So I've briefly uploaded the slides.
I mean, I'm really glad that, for example, I do not also from a concept, b3scale tries to not do too much with the requests, or tries to not too hard to parse and decode and so on. For example, request parameters and so on. Only when it's really necessary, like for example splitting disabled features and so on. So ideally, even if this API changes in its parameters right now, these parameters are getting passed more or less transparently to BigBlueButton. However, if new endpoints are created and so on, yeah, then I need to do some updates. Luckily, the API was quite stable over time, so not so much of an issue there.
Okay. So I think we try to keep in touch. I still would like some forum that isn't the Google mailing list, but yeah, we'll manage, I think.
We should use Matrix.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fine by me.
Yeah.
Let's go. So
I hinted at it, like eventually we want to get BigBlueButton, if we can, on the Matrix. It's just where the better place to be. Daniel, if you want to set up or Annika, if you want to set up a Matrix channel and publish it to BigBlueButton Dev and say, hey, look, there's work. We're all working on load balancers. Let's collaborate together. And
I think, yeah, I think we should make a BigBlueButton. We should create a BigBlueButton space, is what they call it in Matrix, and then you can basically issue. Then you can basically have one channel per topic. So like general or dev, general, scalar, whatever, and then divide it up like that. That turned out to be the best organization so far I've seen with Matrix. Yeah. So then you basically, otherwise you end up like having one channel that is too busy to follow.
Yeah.
Okay. Daniel, maybe ping me after this call, and
right.
We don't have to do it right. We could collaborate right now, or just ping me by email, and let's work together and get that set up.
Perfect. Let's do that. Okay. Thank you for attending.
Alrighty, guys. We have about 2 minutes left, so I don't know if there's any other questions that some of the viewers may have, but just want to let you guys know that there is still time to ask some of those questions. But other than that, if there is nothing left, I'll go ahead and I'll stop the recording.